The first time a German flak officer saw the silver shapes coming out of the sun, he laughed, then stopped laughing when the sky began to scream. At first they were only glints, harmless as fish scales, flashing far above the cloud layer. He lifted his binoculars lazily, expecting British bombers crawling in low, hugging weather and darkness as they always did. Instead, the lenses filled with rows upon rows of aircraft flying so high and so tightly packed that they seemed unreal, like something drawn by an overconfident artist. Sunlight reflected off polished aluminum skins, turning the entire sky into a blinding sheet of white fire. Then the sound reached him, a deep, rolling thunder that pressed against the chest and rattled teeth. This was not a raid. This was an arrival. The officer's laughter died in his throat. He lowered the binoculars and shouted orders that came out hoarse and sharp, his voice already fighting panic. Around him, flak crews scrambled, boots slipping on frozen mud, hands shaking as they swung guns skyward. The American bombers did not dodge or scatter. They flew straight on, unwavering, as if the entire sky belonged to them, and they were merely passing through their own territory. Black bursts of flak blossomed uselessly around the formation, punching holes in the air, but failing to break the rigid lines. The bombers absorbed the explosions like a marching army taking musket fire and refusing to stop. Inside one of those aircraft, a young American pilot named Thomas Hale gripped the yoke and forced his breathing to stay even. The noise was constant engines roaring, metal shuddering, alarms whining, but it was a noise he had learned to live inside. His co-pilot called out engine readings, his navigator muttered coordinates, and somewhere behind him a gunner swore as flak fragments rattled against the fuselage. Hale did not look back. He kept his eyes forward, focused on the faint shape of the lead bomber ahead of him. Break formation and you died. Stay in it and you might live. That was the rule drilled into him until it felt like instinct. German fighter pilots rose to meet them, Messerschmitts clawing upward with practiced aggression. To the Germans, these Americans looked slow, fat, and foolish, flying in daylight, daring the Luftwaffe to come and kill them. The first attack was vicious. Fighters slashed through the formation, cannons blazing, ripping engines apart and shattering glass. One bomber lurched sideways, its wing torn open, smoke pouring out like blood from a wound. For a moment, the German pilots expected panic. They expected the formation to unravel, to scatter like frightened birds. It did not. The damaged bomber struggled, its engines coughing and spitting flame, but it stayed in line. Gunners fired back in disciplined arcs, tracers stitching the sky. The Americans did not chase, did not break. They endured. Another bomber exploded, vanishing in a ball of fire that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The formation closed ranks, the empty space filled by others sliding inward with mechanical precision. Watching from below, the flak officer felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. These men were not reacting emotionally, they were functioning. As bombs began to fall, the earth itself seemed to recoil. Factories, rail yards, and refineries disappeared beneath towering columns of smoke and flame. The officer threw himself into a trench as shock waves rolled across the ground. When he looked up again, the American bombers were already moving on, their silver shapes drifting calmly toward the horizon, as if destruction were merely another task on a long list. Later that day, German soldiers pulled a man from the wreckage of a crashed bomber at the edge of a field. He was bleeding, his flight jacket torn, one leg bent at an angle that made seasoned infantrymen wince. Yet when they dragged him clear, he waved away their concern and asked, in awkward German, if anyone had a cigarette. Someone handed him one. The American lit it with trembling hands, took a long drag, and smiled weakly. "Hell of a day," he said, as if commenting on the weather. The soldiers exchanged glances. This was not how defeated men were supposed to behave. Word spread quickly through German units. These Americans were strange. They did not seem afraid in the right way. Prison guards noticed it first. Captured American pilots did not slump or avoid eye contact. They looked around, taking mental notes. They asked questions. Some even cracked jokes, humor dry and out of place amid barbed wire and watchtowers. It unsettled the guards more than defiance ever could. In the Luftwaffe mess halls, pilots argued late into the night. Older aces scoffed, insisting that the Americans were amateurs relying on numbers alone. They fly like machines, one said dismissively. No finesse. But others, especially those who had faced them repeatedly, were quieter. They spoke of how American gunners fired with discipline, how formations adapted after each loss, how escorts once absent now appeared suddenly, aggressive and fearless. One German pilot, a veteran of Spain and France, wrote in his notebook that the Americans reminded him of something he could not name. It bothered him for days until the answer came while watching a factory assembly line. Each worker performed a single task perfectly, without flourish, without hesitation. Alone, they were nothing special. Together, they were unstoppable. In the air, the Americans kept coming. They returned the next day, and the next, and the next. Losses mounted on both sides, but while German squadrons grew thinner and more exhausted, the American formations seemed endlessly renewed. New aircraft, new crews, same cold determination. German pilots who once hunted now found themselves hunted. Escorts pressed attacks with a ferocity that left no room to breathe. Mistakes were punished instantly. On one mission, a German ace dove on a bomber he had damaged earlier, convinced it would finally break formation. As he closed in, the bomber's gunners tracked him calmly. Tracers ripped past his cockpit, forcing him to pull away at the last second. Sweat soaked his glove. As he climbed back to altitude, he realized something with a jolt of fear. The Americans were no longer reacting to him. They were anticipating him. By the time winter set in, morale among German air units had begun to crack. Pilots stared upward whenever engines echoed across the sky, their stomachs tightening at the familiar thunder. The Americans no longer seemed reckless. They seemed patient, methodical, as if they knew time itself was on their side. For Thomas Hale, the missions blurred together: takeoff, climb, formation, flak, fighters, bombs, return. Faces changed. Empty bunks appeared and stayed empty. He learned not to ask where someone had gone. Yet something hardened inside him with every flight. Fear did not disappear, but it became manageable, something he could fold away and carry. On his 20th mission, flak tore through his bomber, shredding an engine and killing the radio operator instantly. Smoke filled the cockpit. Alarms screamed, and the aircraft began to lose altitude. Hale's crew waited for his command. He thought of breaking formation, of diving away to save them. Then he saw the lead bomber ahead, still flying, still steady. He held his course. They made it back across the channel, limping, barely alive. When the wheels touched the runway, Hale realized his hands were bleeding where his nails had dug into his palms. He laughed then, a short, shaky sound that surprised even him. Across the lines, a German intelligence officer read reports and felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. These Americans were not going to be frightened into retreat. They were not going to run out of men or machines anytime soon. They were learning, adapting, and growing stronger with each encounter. The sky, once Germany's shield, was slowly becoming its enemy. And it had begun with silver shapes in the sun, flying straight and true, daring the world to stop them, and discovering, to everyone's shock, that no one could. As the air war deepened, German fighter pilots began to understand that what they were facing was not simply an enemy, but a system. At first, many had dismissed the Americans as overconfident newcomers, men who relied on mass rather than mastery. Early victories had reinforced that belief. American bombers fell from the sky in burning spirals, and young German pilots returned to base boasting that the enemy would soon learn respect. But respect did not arrive the way they expected. Instead of retreating, the Americans returned with changes small at first, then unmistakable. In squadron-ready rooms across Germany, chalkboards filled with new silhouettes and tactics. American formations shifted subtly, tightening intervals, adjusting altitude bands, coordinating fire zones. Gunners who once fired wildly now waited, conserving ammunition until targets filled their sights. German pilots noticed it immediately. Attacks that had once slipped through now met walls of traces. The sky grew more dangerous, not louder, not more chaotic, but sharper like a blade being honed. Lieutenant Karl Weiss felt it on a grey morning over Schweinfurt. He had already flown more than 100 missions, and survived what many of his classmates had not. Experience had taught him when to attack and when to disengage, when courage became stupidity. That morning, he climbed into the thin air, above the bombers, sun at his back, confident, steady. He chose a bomber on the edge of the formation, just as he always had. As he rolled into his dive, something felt wrong. The gunners were already turning. Traces reached for him sooner than expected, forcing him to break away before firing a shot. Back at base, Weiss sat silently while younger pilots talked excitedly about close calls and narrow escapes. He said nothing, but his hands shook slightly as he poured his coffee. That night, he opened his diary and wrote that the Americans were learning too fast. Faster than they should. They adapt like a machine that remembers, he wrote. Each loss makes them stronger. German commanders noticed the shift as well. Reports that once spoke of enemy recklessness now carry different language. Persistent, aggressive, highly disciplined. Escort fighters, once scattered and hesitant, now pressed attacks deep into German airspace. They no longer broke off when fuel ran low or resistance stiffened. They stayed, they hunted. The sky was no longer a battlefield that reset each day. It was becoming occupied territory. In one engagement near Leipzig, a group of American fighters broke formation to chase retreating German aircraft. A German pilot smiled grimly, believing the old mistake was repeating itself. Then the trap closed. Additional American fighters dropped from higher altitude, cutting off escape routes with brutal precision. The German pilot barely made it back, his aircraft riddled with holes, his nerves shredded. On the ground he stared at the damage and felt something unfamiliar. Claw at his chest, not fear of death, but fear of inevitability. Captured American pilots added to the unease. Interrogators expected bravado or ignorance. Instead, they encountered quiet confidence. The Americans spoke openly about tactics, production, training cycles, not revealing secrets, but revealing scale. They talked about factories that ran day and night, about replacement, already in training, about missions stacked endlessly into the future. One interrogator later admitted that listening to them felt like staring at a rising tide and realizing the wall would not hold. In prisoner camps, patterns emerged. American pilots formed routines quickly. They exercised, organized lectures, shared information. They treated captivity as temporary, a problem to be managed rather than a fate to be endured. German guards noticed how they watched the sky, counting aircraft by sound, tracking the war even from behind wire. It was unsettling. These men did not behave like prisoners of a losing side. They behaved like men who fully expected to win. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe strained under the weight of constant defense. Fuel shortages worsened. Training hours shrank. Veteran pilots flew multiple missions a day, exhaustion dulling reflexes that once seemed sharp enough to cut air itself. Younger pilots arrived with barely enough experience to survive their first encounter. Against them were Americans who arrived fresh, rotated, rested, and reinforced. The imbalance grew obvious to anyone willing to see it. Karl Weiss lost 2 wingmen in a single week. Both were young, barely trained, their enthusiasm no match for American coordination. At their funerals, Weiss stood stiffly, helmet under his arm, listening to speeches about sacrifice and destiny. He believed none of it anymore. In his diary, his handwriting grew cramped and dark. "We are being worn down," he wrote, "not by brilliance, but by endurance." American pilots, for their part, felt the change too. Early missions had been chaos, fear, confusion, improvisation. Now there was structure, Briefings grew longer and more precise. Lessons from losses were fed directly back into training. Pilots like Thomas Hale noticed how new crews arrived already aware of German tactics that had nearly killed him months earlier. The Americans did not repeat mistakes. They catalogued them. On one mission, Hale watched as escort fighters peeled off at exactly the right moment, intercepting German aircraft before they could even reach firing range. The sky felt controlled, almost orderly. After landing, Hale realized something that surprised him. For the first time, he felt something close to confidence, not bravado, not arrogance, but trust in the system around him. German pilots began to speak less of individual heroism and more of survival. Kill tallies mattered less than simply returning. The sky no longer rewarded daring. It punished it. American pilots did not duel for glory, they fought to remove threat efficiently. That difference weighed heavily. A German ace could still win a fight, but the war was no longer a series of fights. It was a process, and the Americans were better at processes. In late 1944, a German intelligence summary circulated quietly among senior officers. It stated plainly that American air superiority was no longer a future threat but a present fact. The language was dry, technical, but the conclusion was devastating. Without control of the air, nothing else could be held. Factories, railways, cities, armies. The war on the ground was being decided above it. Civilians felt it too. American fighters roamed freely, striking trains, bridges, columns of trucks. The sound of engines overhead no longer brought hope that defenders would respond. It brought resignation. People learned to look up and know, instantly, whose aircraft ruled the sky. The stars on the wings became symbols, not just of attack, but of inevitability. Carl Weiss flew his last mission on a clear afternoon. He never saw the American fighter that caught him. Later, a farmer found the wreckage smoking in a field, the black cross shattered, the pilot gone. Somewhere else, an American pilot marked a small symbol on his aircraft and moved on to the next mission, barely pausing to reflect. By then, the truth was impossible to deny. German pilots no longer asked whether they could win the air war. They asked how long they could endure it. And in that shift from confidence to calculation, from ambition to survival, the outcome had already been written. By the final year of the war, fear no longer announced itself with shouting or panic inside German air units. It arrived quietly, settling into routines, into pauses before takeoff, into the way pilots studied the sky a second longer than necessary. American aircraft were everywhere now. They did not merely appear for specific targets and vanish. They lingered. They patrolled. They owned the air in a way no enemy ever had before. For German pilots, the sky had once been a place of freedom, of speed and mastery. Now it felt watched. Airfields became places of waiting rather than anticipation. Mechanics worked tirelessly, patching bullet holes, replacing shattered canopies, coaxing worn engines back to life with dwindling resources. Pilots stood nearby, helmets in hand, listening to the distant rumble that had become the soundtrack of their days. When the sound grew louder, they knew whether it belonged to friend or foe before anyone told them. The American engines had a particular presence, heavy, confident, layered. They did not sound like visitors. They sounded permanent. Orders still came, of course. Scramble. Intercept. Defend, but the tone had changed. There was no talk of driving the enemy back, no bold predictions of turning point. Missions were described in terms of minimizing damage, of slowing the inevitable. Pilots were warned not to engage unless absolutely necessary. Survival had replaced victory as the unspoken objective. German civilians felt it just as deeply. Children learned to identify American fighters by silhouette before they learned their multiplication tables. Mothers learned which cellars were safest, which times of day were most dangerous. Trains halted in open countryside when engines were heard overhead, their crews scattering into ditches before bombs even fell. The fear was not chaotic anymore. It was structured, disciplined, mirroring the very force that caused it. In prisoner camps, captured German pilots spoke more openly than they ever had before. Some admitted, quietly and without drama, that the war in the air was lost. They spoke of American pilots not with hatred, but with a reluctant respect that surprised even themselves. "They are always there," one said, "no matter how many we shoot down." Another added, "They do not need heroes, they have systems." American pilots noticed the change as well. Resistance was still fierce at times, but it lacked the desperation of a force fighting for its future. Interceptions were fewer. German attacks were sharper but shorter, breaking off quickly rather than pressing to the end. Escorts found themselves with more freedom, more time over targets. For men like Thomas Hale, the missions felt different, not easier, but clearer. The chaos had thinned. The enemy's will, not just their numbers, was eroding. On long escort flights, Hale watched the ground pass beneath him, cities scarred by smoke, rail yards twisted into useless knots of steel, roads crowded with refugees moving without direction. He did not feel triumph. He felt weight. The destruction was vast, impersonal and final, yet he understood its purpose. Every intact factory meant more guns firing at his friends. Every undamaged rail line meant more soldiers reaching the front. This was not cruelty, he told himself. It was necessity, carried out with relentless precision. German commanders, long stripped of illusions, began preparing for a future they no longer spoke about publicly. Files were burned. Equipment was hidden or destroyed. Orders emphasized evacuation and delay rather than defense. The air war had taught them a brutal lesson. Without the sky, everything else was temporary. Armies could maneuver, cities could resist, speeches could inspire, but none of it mattered if American aircraft could reach anywhere, anytime. One German intelligence officer, reviewing aerial photographs late one night, realized that there were almost no areas left untouched. The Americans had mapped the country in detail, turning geography itself into a vulnerability. He closed the folder and sat in silence, understanding that the war's outcome was no longer a question of courage or sacrifice. It was arithmetic. In the final months, German pilots sometimes watched American formations pass overhead without engaging at all. Fuel was too precious, aircraft too rare, lives too costly. They stood on the ground, looking up at contrails crisscrossing the sky, like chalk lines on a blackboard, marking problems already solved. The Americans did not acknowledge them, they did not need to. When American fighters strafed airfields, the message was unmistakable. This was not a battlefield anymore, it was a demonstration of control. German ground crews ran for cover as bullets tore through parked aircraft, through fuel trucks, through the illusion that anything could still be protected. The attacks were fast, efficient, devastating. They were not meant to terrify, they were meant to finish. In prisoner camps, German guards treated captured American pilots differently now. There was no cruelty in it, just distance, an awareness that these men represented the future order of things. Conversations became cautious, respectful. Some guards asked questions about life in America, about what would come after the war. The Americans answered carefully, unsure themselves, but confident that there would be an after. As the fighting collapsed inward, toward cities and final lines of defense, the air war continued almost unchanged. American aircraft flew regardless of weather, regardless of conditions on the ground. They supported advances, destroyed remaining infrastructure, and hunted the last pockets of resistance with tireless efficiency. For Germans watching from below, it felt as though the sky itself had chosen a side. On the day the war ended, the silence was strange. Engines faded, contrails dissolved. For the first time in years, the sky was just the sky again. Germans stepped outside, cautiously, half expecting the thunder to return. Some cried. Some simply stood and stared upward, unsure how to exist without the constant presence of American aircraft shaping every decision. Thomas Hale was on a base far from home when the news arrived. There was no cheering at first, just relief so heavy it felt unreal. He thought of the men who had not made it back, of the cities he had flown over, of the German pilots who had tried and failed to stop him. He did not feel hatred toward them, he felt understanding. They had fought hard, but they had been fighting the future. Years later, German veterans would speak of the war in the air with a particular tone. Not bitterness, not nostalgia, but clarity. They would say that the moment they truly knew the war was lost was not when armies crossed borders or cities fell, but when American pilots took the sky and never gave it back. When daylight itself became hostile. When courage and skill were no longer enough to change the outcome. What Germans really thought about American pilots in the end was simple and devastating. They were not invincible. They were not superhuman. But they represented a force that could not be stopped once it gathered momentum. A force built not on individual brilliance alone, but on organization, industry, and relentless learning. And when the last aircraft disappeared, and the war finally ended, that truth remained writ invisibly across the sky, a reminder that the battle for the future is often decided long before the final shot is fired by those who understand not just how to fight, but how to endure, adapt, and return again and again until nothing is left to resist.